Good evening and welcome to the Mount Gretna School of Art lecture series hosted here in the Pennsylvania Chautauqua's Historic Hall of Philosophy. I'm Jay Noble, Director of Mount Gretna School of Art. It's a 7-week summer intensive program and it's all about going outside and connecting with nature and learning about the nature of seeing. I want to thank Stinson Strout for his support of the lecture series and Purpose One. So now I'm going to introduce Martin. I met Martin when he came to be a critic here several years ago, and it was a good experience. So it's fun to have you back. Can I tell them the story about how you said it was the best rejection letter ever?
Please do.
Okay, so he applied to be a 4-pillar and then didn't get in. But I thought he was really good. So I said, "Oh, you can't be a 4-pillar, but could you come be a critic?" And he told me it was the best rejection letter ever. But anyway, Martin is a New York, New Jersey-based mixed media artist who studied at Pratt Institute, Marywood University, and the New York Studio School of Drawing, Painting, and Sculpture, where in 2015 he received his MFA. He was the 2015 recipient of the Peter Rippon Royal Academy European Travel Grant, a 2016 artist in residence at the Sam and Adele Golden Foundation, 2017-18 Trestle Open Studio Residency. I'm going to jump forward. Dull has been guest speaker and critic at several institutions, including the New York Studio School, Pratt, Fordham, and Hunter College. He has co-curated exhibits throughout the New York metropolitan area and was co-founder of the curatorial collaborative JMN Artists.
That's correct.
Dull has taught as an adjunct instructor at both Caldwell University in Caldwell, New Jersey, and Marywood University in Scranton. In June 2021, he was selected by the organization Fresh Air Montclair to create a public installation along Bloomfield Avenue in Montclair, New Jersey. Dull's artwork has been included in both group and solo exhibits throughout the United States, most notably solo exhibits with John Davis Gallery in Hudson, New York, M. David and Company in Brooklyn in 2019, and Equity Gallery, New York in 2024. And I'm happy to have you here. Martin's going to be your critic for the next 2 days, and this is your chance to hear him talk. Thank you, Martin.
Well, thank you, Jay, and thank you to Mount Gretna School of Art. This is a great opportunity. I wanted to kind of create a lecture geared towards partially my time as a kind of fresh artist just out of graduate school with a lot of voices in my head, and segue kind of quickly into my practice now and these sort of milestones or markers along the way that got me to thinking and creating the way that I think and create now. Jay had mentioned that I did a European travel grant, which was something that I was afforded after my 2 years of graduate studies. I was granted a certain amount of money to travel through Europe. I went to Europe with the idea that I would go see Rembrandt's The Night Watch in Amsterdam, and that would be like the thing that would blow my mind and change my life forever. Obviously, it's a fantastic painting, but what I thought would happen to me isn't what happened to me. And in fact, it was the time that I spent in Rome at the Vatican Museum looking at particularly 2 paintings. One was these Quattrocento predella panels that opened up my language. They changed the way that I saw the function of painting and image in painting. And the particular painting that really blew my mind was this particular Fra Angelico predella panel, which is part of a series of 3 panels. But it was the rhythms in this painting. It was the way that the mountains and the sails and the figures, there's this sort of ellipse shape that runs throughout the painting. And I saw it as so related to what we would think of as the gestural art of the 1950s, the 1960s. And it's pre-high Renaissance. So you sort of get this non-literal, non-scientific representation of things, this sort of visceral representation of objects. Anyway, so this was a huge influence on the way that I was seeing painting at the time. And then the second painting that really stuck out to me that I think of quite often was another one from the Vatican Museum, which was this Caravaggio painting, which again, you can sort of draw these linear marks throughout and create these ellipsed shapes, sort of create this flurry of figures in the painting. But something else very interesting happens in this painting, and especially if you see this painting in person, this sensation is quite striking, is that if you look closely at the composition, the corner of the block that the figures are positioned on at the bottom of this painting, it hits right up at the front of what would be considered like let's say a painting were made from a pane of glass back. It butts up right against that pane of glass. And at the time, there was this concept of painting, that painting happens from the surface of the painting back. You don't break the surface of the painting. The Caravaggio, being Caravaggio, says, well, I'm the greatest painter that's ever lived. I'm going to do something to put everybody to shame. I'm going to make this painting real. And he throws that elbow, that orange elbow, right out of the surface of the painting. It confronts people in the real space of the real world. So if you were looking at this painting at that time, you would get a sense that all of a sudden the illusion of painting was shattered and you had somebody walking out of a painting into your own personal space. Thinking about that in terms of modern painting language, this was a moment that gave me a lot of license to start to break down and work with how we experience paintings spatially, we experience paintings personally, that we just experience paintings as human beings. Post that travel grant, I come back to the States, I work for a few years, and I had my first solo exhibition in Brooklyn. And I was moving between this idea of sculpture, but I would not say that I make sculpture because I think about my sculptures as a painter thinks about paintings. So I'm very particular in not claiming that I am a sculptor, but I make these three-dimensional objects, these sculptural objects, in these paintings. And this was my kind of first foray into moving past observational painting, past looking at the figure in the real world and trying to figure out what it was that I was always trying to pull from the observations that I was making in the real world. And I started working a lot from memory, a lot from idea, and a lot from this concept of conflating ideas. So things that I've seen, experiences that I've had in nature, but trying to use memories of all those things to place them into a painting or into an object to create perhaps some sort of synonymous experience for the viewer without being literal about it. So I was working on these gestural abstractions, thinking about compression of space, thinking about landscape, thinking about figures in the landscape, and dealing with the language of abstraction through my formal training as a perceptual painter. And it brought me to interesting places, but it seemed like that I was just scratching the surface. And something else became apparent to me. It became apparent to me that some of my influences from my prior education, so one of my mentors in graduate school was a painter by the name of Graham Nixon, who creates these bather paintings. And one of them in particular, this one is at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And I had been down there looking at this painting. And I realized that, yes, he deals with observation and he deals with the figure, but he's also dealing with an idea of organization. How do you take things from the outside world and put them into a painting? Well, you organize them in a way that the language in the painting speaks to the outside world, but isn't necessarily literal. And I started to think a lot about the quiet organization that goes on in work such as Graham's, but I'm not a very quiet painter. So I started to think about how objects organize themselves in the studio or how everything refers to everything else. I started to think about how pieces on a wall can become a piece in and of themselves, how relative everything is to everything else. And, this relates right back to that elbow in that Caravaggio painting, because it became about a painting that can go inside of its edges and create space moving back. It became about a painting that can talk about the surface of itself, but it also became about what happens when you also allow that that surface and that space and that painting to dump right out of the surface of the painting and become a part of the room, become a part of the thing that's around it. Thinking in a kind of more holistic way about how art functions in a space. And again, this brought me back to this time spent in Rome, this time going to different churches and cathedrals, and you start to realize that you might have different artists making different, paintings and sculpture, but they're all in service to a particular space, and then they're all in service to a very particular idea. I think we're at a point in time where it doesn't necessarily have to be about any sort of spiritual idea or any sort of specific type of space, but that language and that kind of opening up of experience into the real world and then back into the metaphysical world. I mean, these are the kind of conversations that we have agency to have as contemporary artists. So I started organizing these small paintings that I would make on wood on walls, and I started to think about the different shapes that those could make. And simultaneous to making these small works, which kind of allowed me to get real close and inside of something and then step back and organize it. So this would be an example of some of those small works up close. So they're considered both at a distance and close and relative to each other. I started to think about too, how you could take little moments that were happening around the studio and big moments that were happening around the studio and interesting textures and objects that were laying around the studio and how you could start to conflate them together. And you could use many little moments to make something large, and where does quiet need to happen? Where does frenetic energy need to happen? How do you compose when you're trying to engage an entire surface? How do you pull back? How do you move in and out of something? As a maker, I'm very quick in my decisions, and that I realized was a very deliberate choice on my part, because the quicker I move, the less I can preconceive, the less I can know the mark that I'm going to put down. And in doing that, I can still excite myself by a mark I make. But the problem with doing that is you start to get these kind of revisionist quick paintings, which can look sexy and they can look slick, but they never had the depth of experience that I was looking for in a painting. And it was around that time that I realized that time itself can become the element to slow something down. So you can make a lot of quick moves and even a lot of quick works, but you can take them and you can break them and you can pull them apart and you can put them back together in interesting ways. You can move things around kind of infinitely until they sort of click. I was at an artist lecture the other weekend, and they were talking about, how do you know when your painting is done? It was always an interesting issue for me because there's no literal bellwether, right? Like I'm always trying to fight out a recognizable symbol. I'm always trying to fight out something that somebody could kind of directly place a narrative on in my painting to sort of make the painting about developing a new narrative. But really, it becomes about this conflation of object, of place. Again, related to that Caravaggio elbow, I started incorporating electric light into the painting because I started to think about that idea of painterly light, the light that you can get that resonates from deep inside a painting that is an illusion of light that moves through the surface and hits your eye, that makes you think of light in a painting. But I thought, well, what if that exists, but also what if the literal equivalent also exists in a painting? What if colored light exists on top of a painting? How does that affect the light in the painting, the light on the painting? And then how does it affect the space that the painting occupies? An obvious reference and kind of starting point for some of this thought was also Rauschenberg, because Rauschenberg is kind of working from the surface out, right? I don't feel he's maybe investigating the the surface backspace the way that I'm interested in investigating it, which I think is rooted primarily in my observational painting background. But he did give license and agency towards moving from a surface out. So basically, my studio practice has developed into trying to break down the language of painting to as basic an element as I can, and then trying to re-expand it into something that both works with and breaks apart the ideas that we think of as painters. And I wanted to share that particularly with you all, because I think that if it wasn't for my moving as far into observational painting as I could, in trying to understand anatomy and the figure as much as I could, and trying to understand the natural world as much as I could, I don't think I could have come out on the other end with the same agency to create the things that I want to create. And so many of my friends are very pure observational painters from the landscape. And we have these amazing conversations about the exact same things, about the exact same ideas in painting. We just reiterate them in different ways. And I think it's very important to realize as an artist to not feel beholden to what a good artist does, but to realize that if you learn what a quote unquote good artist does, it gives you agency to do the thing that you do that other people might find a problem, but is something that is so intrinsically yours that it becomes your strength. And then I just wanted to go through my process a little bit. So probably in one of my more recent works in the studio, and just how it started in one place and ended up in a completely different place. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but anyway, so this is where it ended up. It went through a lot of, it had Christmas lights hanging on it at one time. The painting at the top, it was sort of a red and umber and yellow painting. And then I decided that I had to wash it with this dark blue, like a very watered down dark blue that I really love, and just kind of wash it all out to create these sort of deep recessive blacks. And then it allowed some of the gesture that had already been there to survive at the top of the painting. And then I found this awful and wonderful green that you can't really tell here, but it kind of modulates between a more acidic and a cooler green as it moves through the gesture. But I kind of found that, and I kind of took the scaffolding apart, and then I put the scaffolding back on, and I go, oh my gosh, it's about an idea of rhythm. It's about an idea of sound. It's about an idea of, there's something musical about this in a sense. So I thought, well, it needs chimes, and it needs colorful chimes. So my favorite thing to do is to walk through Home Depot and find things that I can use as marks in my painting that are not painting related at all, shapes and things that I can then bring back to the studio and cut and paint and make into what I consider marks or gestures in my work, which is a very roundabout way, I think, of making a painting. But it's almost, I think that a painting doesn't have to be made with paint. I think a painting has to be made with somebody thinking about painting, thinking about space as a painter, thinking about color and movement as a painter. And I think that means that a painting can take on a million forms. And it's beholden on anybody that, you know, wants to really go that deep into what painting is to actually the work leaning up against the wall on the right-hand side. That's a earlier iteration of that same painting. I think it's our job to learn where we sit in a language. I think if you're a painter, a poet, a musician, whatever you are, I think the onus is on us to understand where we sit in the language and the rich history of that language. And then I think the next step is to break it wide open and to reinvent the wheel in the most amazing way that only we can as individuals. And I think that that's where the magic starts to happen. So anyway, that's it. I'm much better with questions, so please ask questions.
Thanks, Martin. Thank you.
I'm interested on your connection with sculpture. And I'm curious if you could speak on your history of, I guess, interest in clay and sculpture and how it's, affected and modulated into the paintings.
Sure. So when I first went into my undergraduate program, I actually went in as a sculpture major, which lasted about all of maybe 3 weeks. And oddly enough, my teachers had this very rigid idea of how they wanted a person to express or work with sculptural elements. And I don't know, I was a teenager and I was really angsty and I wanted to do what I wanted to do. And I just kind of didn't like that. And I had a drawing class and my drawing teacher thought I had some promise in drawing. So they say, well, have you ever thought about painting? And I said, yeah, but painting's boring. Like all those like Renaissance stuff. And you go to a museum and it's so quiet. And they're like, oh, well, don't you know about, abstract expressionism? And don't you know about Rauschenberg and combines and things like that? And all of a sudden it piqued my interest. So I switched over to becoming a painting major and I kind of never looked back. The interesting thing that happened is when I got into the painting department, I had some wonderful instructors that taught me about the poetry of looking, the poetry that can be found in the crease of fingers on a figure and things like that. So I started to become obsessed with life drawing. And that obsession continued up until graduate school, really, when I decided to think about expanding what I was doing. And I took some sculpture classes in graduate school. And I had a wonderful life-size figure sculpting teacher that would talk about Raphael and the way that Raphael and his sculptures would paint with light in 3 dimensions. How every little fold of fabric and things creates a gesture of light that is very painterly. And all of a sudden, the painterly world in 3 dimensions opened up to me. So that's why I love making things that are 3-dimensional, but I really hesitate to qualify them as sculptures because I think that there is a way of thinking about sculpture that I don't. I think I'm a painter that makes 3-dimensional objects. And maybe it's just because that's what works for me. And I feel like that's what makes these things work. And, kind of whatever works, you might as well do it. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I'm curious about your materials.
Okay.
Where you get them, what's your favorite materials? What are your favorite binders to connect?
Sure. So you're curious about materials and where I get. I've dabbled in welding a little bit, but it's not for me, not because I don't think that I couldn't do it, but because again, I'm impatient and I want to work quickly. And in an artistic way, maybe that could be interesting in welding, but that is not good welding. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that I'm working with a lot of found objects, but this goes back to when I talked about how time becomes an integral part of slowing the work down. So what I actually end up doing is I haunt the aisles of, let's say, a Home Depot or, gosh, even the local supermarket. I'm buying groceries. I see something that I go, oh, that's an interesting texture. That's an interesting form. Or I wonder what would happen if I put paint on that. Or I wonder what would happen if I bent that. Or so I'll kind of collect these objects, but they're new objects. And then I'll have them in the studio sometimes a week, sometimes 6 months, sometimes 5 years. And they'll probably make their way into different work. They'll probably get painted on. They'll be the wrong color. I'll paint them again. I'll cut them in half. I'll put them back together. And over time, they start to have their own identity and they start to talk to other work in the room. And then sometimes I end up putting all that work together and they become bigger, more resolved works. And then sometimes they click. And when they click, and I'm lucky to know that they're clicking, I realize I have something. As far as materials, when I was in graduate school, I started to dabble a little bit with acrylic paint. And I realized that for my temperament, acrylic paint worked great because you can get acrylic to stay open for a while, but it will still not be as slippery as oil. I used to ruin oil paintings all the time because I get impatient and I just have to scrape the whole thing away. With acrylic, they would dry enough to leave a history that I could keep working on and working out, but quickly. And then I was lucky to do the Golden Foundation residency, and I learned all about acrylic mediums. Acrylic mediums are basically binders. Their function isn't just to suspend pigment, it's also as a glue. So you can use acrylic paint and acrylic mediums as glue. So what I use to assemble is like GAC 100 or, modeling paste or what, and they create strong bonds, but they also make, depending on what you want to use, they also make interesting surfaces. So you could have it glossy, you could have it matte, you could build things around the thing that you're gluing together if the binder is thick enough, right? So to answer your question in a roundabout way, I'm using acrylic.
When you first started transitioning into like more sculptural work, did you have any can you think of any notable responses to that like kind of help push you forward?
Probably the ones where people would come in and they'd be like, what is that? Or like, oh, that's weird. I don't know. I kind of love responses like that. I love responses that oftentimes are, well, this is very confrontational. And then people sit with it for a second because of the confrontation. And they go, oh, but it's a lot slower than I thought, or it's a lot quieter than I thought. I think those are the responses that intrigue me the most. And I tend to look for work that I would hope evokes that in somebody looking at it. There, like I said, there's a quickness to the gesture or what I do that I think sits on the surface. And I think that that's the first reading. But I try to do something wacky or beautiful or whatever that gets them to sit with it for a second. And I feel like the trick is once they sit for a second, there's got to be enough there to keep pulling them in, to just keep pulling them in further and further. So, yeah.
So my question is about representation. You talked about how you have this one piece where it represents sound, but you kind of discovered that maybe along the way.
Yeah.
Are there any pieces that you go in where you say, okay, I want this piece to kind of represent this? Or is it always like you discover the meaning kind of
Content?
theme, yeah, the content or theme along the way, or is it always along the way, or are there times where you go in with a theme?
So I always go in with an impetus. There's always a reason I started painting. It's some need or it's some want or it's something I think of or I want to exist or I want to talk about. The problem is every time I know what I want it to be, it falls as flat as it could on its face. So I've learned that the reason to go in is the reason to go in, and that makes it valid. But I've learned for myself that I need to exercise and execute the million reasons along the way, like where it takes me and then where I take it and then where it takes me. But inevitably, I think when they become successful, it ends on a note where they brought me to a conclusion rather than I brought that conclusion to it. Because at least for me, in my practice, I kind of have this mantra that if I'm not excited, how can I expect somebody else to look at it and be excited? I think if I step outside of myself and go into the unknown, exciting results happen and I become excited about the thing I'm making. And I think that somehow translates into the way people view the work. But that being said, it can be a very painful process. I've destroyed a million potentially great things because I didn't realize that I should have just stopped at that moment. But you can go forever if you want to on a painting. There's no rule. You need to set up criteria for yourself to know what world you want to exist in as a painter. But once you're existing in that world, the ways to accomplish a painting can be limitless.
So you talked about how you started as an observational painter and artist, and then you transitioned into this more kind of pure abstraction. And I was wondering, I know when I've done various types of work, I look at my work and I start to see these connections, even though they're very different. And I imagine one would be like being a spin. But I'm wondering if there are other things that your earlier observational work to your current work, either in content or technique or
Yeah, my gesture, I feel, is very related to the curves of a body. And thinking about, when I used to work off the figure, I would think about the graceful line that could kind of move up, down, and around in an entire form. Think about Ang or something like that, where it's just these just beautiful, graceful curves. And then, I mean, fast forward to some of the body-based work of some of the gestural painters of like the 60s or 70s. I think it's very still related to that same idea because it's so related to the body. So the gesture in the work is definitely pulled straight from that type of observation. And then the way, I don't have a desire to use color in any sort of scientific way, but a lot of reason that I use color is pulled from moments of light or distemper that I see in the real world, but then also obfuscated through memory. I'm very interested at how memory is how we relate to the world, but it's also very flawed from the reality of the situation that you're remembering. So I like to exercise memory in the studio. Sometimes it's even just close my eyes and think of a place or a form or a piece of light or something and use that color and make that mark and see if I can capture a piece of that memory in the mark. It sounds so ethereal or esoteric or something, but it's like not. It's very simple to me in a sense. Does that answer the question?
yeah, I think so. I guess I guess I just wonder if you were to, your current painting with your old painting, what imagine students. And so maybe you're saying it's the gesture.
It's the hand. Yeah, no, it's definitely the hand, and it's definitely the paint handling. Even when I was working with oil paint, I'm interested in not just drawing forms in paint, but actually pushing paint around to endorse forms. And I was doing that as a figurative painter too, I think. Not render a nose, but like, what if you just put a piece of paint that becomes a nose? That kind of handling, I think, has become even more overt, but that was always there.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a follow-up to Russ's question about why you go to painting. And I wondered if you could maybe point out.
Yeah, so you were asking why I go into a painting and
Show an example of one of these and tell us maybe your thoughts going into it and then how they evolved, what you learned from it as you were working through it, and then where you ended up. Maybe did you come back to the original urge at all?
so this piece, for example, part of what I'll do in these small pieces is I'll use canvas that I will adhere to the surface. And then a lot of times I'll end up peeling that canvas back off, sometimes when the painting's still wet, sometimes when the painting's dry. In this case, the painting was dry. You might be able to tell on sort of the mid-lower right side of the painting, that's wood that was pulled off of the actual block that was on the reverse side of what this was glued on. So a lot of, especially when I started making these little works, they were fairly literal. And in fact, some of them, this one in particular, I would start with like a prompt, something that I like wrote, like a word that I was thinking about. It could be totally banal. It could be like sadness or something. And I'd like scrawl that on there in a gestural form, kind of akin to how I would paint. And then I would kind of start there. And they don't work. But they start me in a direction. And I mean, there's a certain joy and catharsis in painting to begin with. So a painting that was kind of about a lack of joy or a lack of catharsis became about joy and catharsis, and then became about age and time and beauty through age and time, like how distressed surfaces, I find discardable things tend to have a certain inherent wonder and beauty. I know that's like a dirty word for a painter to use, but there's a certain beauty about them that I become very curious about. then this painting still, I think, wasn't working. And then that's when I ripped that square piece off of it and reversed it. And all of a sudden there was a form and there was like pieces of detritus and everything was the mark that I had been looking for the whole time. You know, it's interesting because like by just placing the brush on a surface, I probably couldn't have made that mark. But I did make that mark, but it was by pushing the paint on the other side of the surface and pulling something off and reversing it. Like, and again, it just comes back to, I think, my need to look at these things as paintings and not as objects. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that's as close as I can get to answering your question.
Is it an opportunity to rethink everything, or are you kind of referring, do you think that it's objects that all live together and maybe there's various arrangements, or are you very,
No, no, I'm glad you brought that up. I like to think of what I do as an organic process. It's always changing. I'm always finding a new arrangement in the studio. Gosh, if something stays in the studio long enough, it's probably not safe. The only time I'm committed to a piece and to a form and to an arrangement is once it's in a show. Outside of that, I think it's about they grow with me and I grow with them. And it'd be antithetical to what I want to do to keep these things stagnant or let them exist in one place as one thing. I document as much as I document, but I'm not very good at documenting. But I like the romantic idea again of like memory and the lack of documentation. But remember, sometimes we remember things better than they were. And I kind of think that that's not a bad thing. You know, I mean, I'm sure some of you have had that experience when you were like really young, right? And you'd go into a museum or something and you'd see a piece of art and you were just like, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And maybe it kickstarted your lifelong obsession with painting or sculpture or just being an artist or being creative. And then maybe you go back and you see this thing again for the first time when you're like 30 years old or something. And you're looking at it and you're going, oh, it's like not that interesting. It's not, but it doesn't matter, right? Because it was the thing that you engaged with the first time that kickstarted everything. I don't know, all these things just are important. And I was always accused as a student of like biting off too much, being too maximal, doing too much of this, doing too much of that. But I feel like that's what I do. So I worked very hard at developing ways where that becomes part of a language that becomes concise. Like I said before, like I think it's beholden on us to develop the world that we function in. But once we create that world that we function in, then all of a sudden the sky's the limits. You need limitations to function as an artist, to function in the language of art. But I think once you define where your boundaries are, there's a vast amount of space to explore inside of those boundaries you set up for yourself. That's awesome. I mean, I think that is painting. I mean, the most modern sense of doing that, I think, would be like Cezanne, right? Because Cezanne all of a sudden takes like paint and like sculpts things out of paint, like sculpts these forms out of paint. But even before that, you have different iterations of how to build things out of paint. I mean, Da Vinci had a whole system for how to layer washes of paint to create deep space and forward space and flesh and warmth and cool. And it's a different way of pushing paint around, but it's still pushing paint around. I mean, that's the poetry of what we do. It's like, in a sense, it's the discrepancy, right, between reality and this thing you're making that somehow talks to or about reality, but isn't the real thing that it is substituting itself for. And like, that's where the poetry happens. So yeah, I don't know I don't know if that was a question or how to answer it, but that's exactly it. Like, yeah, just like think about that nose and think about that like chunk of paint. Like everything is in that. Thank you.